name is Lauren. This class has really made me look back on so much of my life experience through a totally different lens, and I think this will be the easiest way for me to express what I've learned. I'm going to be drawing my life, or at least trying to. It all started when my dad met my mom in Manila, Philippines. They dated for a while until my dad received a job offer to be an IT engineer at a company in Tualatin, Oregon. So the two of them got married and came over to the States in 1998, and had me in July of 2000. After staying in an apartment, my parents finally bought a house and settled down in Sherwood, Oregon, a suburb of Portland. Although my parents had a very small Filipino community who came with them from Manila for the same job opportunity, Sherwood was a predominantly white town. Now, I know what you're thinking. You live in the most notoriously white state in the country. Obviously, most places will be 99% white, but when I say white, I mean white. Putting the whiteness of my environment in context, I had never had other non-white or Asian friends outside of my Filipino circle until I went to high school. At one point, it was even considered acceptable for students in my elementary school to do blackface during Halloween, as one girl in my class dressed up as Lil Wayne. Just FYI, she painted her entire body in brown body paint. Yeah. That being said, I went to a Catholic high school in Beaverton, Oregon, and it was a complete culture shock for me. I remember I got so excited during orientation when a Korean girl partnered up with me for an activity, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "Oh my god, what are you?" Yep, I'm still embarrassed, but I couldn't help it. I finally had the chance to make friends with people who might be able to relate to me. During my time in high school, I was so happy to have Asian friends and finally felt like I had a place to fit in. My high school was still predominantly white, but I was so happy to be able to have a friend group where I did not feel like the odd one out, at least not at first. My Asian friends grew up in the major Asian community in Beaverton, an environment completely opposite to mine. In my eyes, they embodied everything I thought a good Asian was supposed to be. All of them were very connected to their culture, came from well-off Asian immigrant families, took every AP class offered, were accepted to Ivy Leagues and other prestigious institutions, and were regionally or nationally recognized in their strategically chosen extracurriculars, whether it be piano, fencing, robotics, or swimming. While I still did quite well in school and felt I could still relate to the pressure of having ambitious Asian immigrant parents, I did start to feel tension grow between them and myself. All of us were implicitly competing to be the most successful, with success being selectively defined by the model minority myth. Here's what I mean by this. For us, a good Asian American looked like two different things. Either you were successful in your academics and extracurriculars, or you were successful in not being too white. Looking back on this, I think all of us seem to be having an internal struggle with having the model minority myth imposed upon everything we did, and as a result, we were all striving to be the best balance of these two things. This competition became more obvious as high school went on, and I couldn't help feeling that I was always in last place. I did not have the stereotypical tiger parents that I associated with my other Asian friends, and I even hated that my parents were not too harsh on me. I had extracurriculars, but I was never the best of the best at anything, unlike my friends who had been forced to do certain activities since they could walk. If my parents had just forced me to do certain extracurricular activities at a young age, maybe I could have been accepted to the prestigious institutions that my friends were accepted to. On top of that, my friends had all been put in advanced study programs outside of school and had been taking extra classes every summer in order to get ahead of everyone else in our grade. Meanwhile, I had to beg my parents to let me take a summer math course just so I could catch up to them, even though we were all already taking college-level math classes. It felt like I was the dumb Asian in my friend group, and during college decision day, I even overheard them mocking UW as a mediocre institution that anyone could get into. So I wasn't considered a good Asian because I was not as smart or well-rounded as my fellow Asian peers, but what about not being too white? Sounds easy enough, right? Yeah, not really. Given the Philippines' history of colonization by the United States, modern Filipino culture has many white American values and practices incorporated into it, making it a bit different from other Asian cultures. While my friends would speak their parents' native language at home and were even enrolled in Chinese or Korean school, my parents always used a mix of English and Tagalog at home and never forced me to speak Tagalog in response since they grew up learning and speaking English in school. While my friends were part of a traditional Indian dance team or celebrated traditional Chinese or Korean holidays with their families, my family did not ever introduce me to traditional Filipino dances or holidays. Other than by watching Filipino dramas and socializing with our Filipino friends, my parents never really taught me about old Filipino culture, and I did not know much about what it meant to be Filipino back in the Philippines. My friends' parents were extremely strict about dating, but especially dating outside of their race and ethnicity. My parents, on the other hand, were still strict about dating, but did not mind if I dated interracially, especially if it was a white guy, given this was something that was almost praised back in the Philippines. For the most part, I pretty much grew up like the white kids I went to school with, and I was not proud of it. I was always trying to compensate for this with my Asian friends, whether it be by showing them the Filipino dish I had for lunch, becoming a leader of the Asian American Club, or even by trying to embrace their cultures over mine by being into K-pop, anime, or Bollywood movies. On top of the mindset I had that being Filipino meant being more white than my Asian peers, I also looked down on it as being a dirty Asian. While we learned in class that Filipinos are the most well-off Asian group in the States, that association was never obvious to me since the only other Filipinos I had met outside of my circle tended to live in what most people would describe as the less desirable areas of Portland. Although my parents seemed to be doing pretty well financially and were able to send me to private school my whole life, they did so by giving up other things like fancy vacations and buying nicer cars. My Asian friends, on the other hand, were all pretty well off and had nice houses, cars, and took vacations every year. To me, they were the fancy Asians. They're Koreans, Chinese, and Indians, whose parents were all successful doctors, engineers, and dentists, while being Filipino made me a poor jungle Asian, as they would sometimes joke about with me. I viewed being Filipino as being the low-class hillbillies of Asia, and it even got to the point where if I was ever asked about being Filipino, I would only reference my mom's side of the family who was from Manila, and completely leave out anything about my dad's side because they were from a more rural and impoverished area of the Philippines. Buying into the model minority myth not only made me ashamed of being Filipino, but it also left me wanting to be a different, better type of Asian, like my friends. Even though all of these conflicts were happening in unspoken ways, my Asian friends and I were still ultimately bonded by the struggles we faced at our predominantly white school. Our sophomore year, our English teacher had us read the graphic novel American-Born Chinese and made a unit all about microaggressions, which was very empowering for my friends and I. It was the first time I felt seen as an Asian American, and it opened my eyes to the microaggressions I had been unknowingly experiencing my whole life. I was able to use this new knowledge to recognize the prejudice and the future experiences I had in high school, in my teachers' blatant assumptions about my academic courses and performance, or when older students would publicly shame me for correcting a teacher's mistake during a math class. However, the most profound realizations I had were about my life prior to high school. Like I said before, we would get back to my time in K-8 school, so here we go. I finally understood why I felt so unsettled about my experiences there. Whereas my Asianness was able to help me find some sense of belonging in high school, it was tied into essentially every disappointing memory I had in school before then. Being self-conscious anytime I won an academic award, trying to avoid getting upset after I was accidentally not recognized for being the top of my class at 8th grade graduation, not knowing what to say when my classmates would tell me to my face I was only smart because I was Asian, having classmates mock me with racial jokes about other Asian groups I did not even belong to. I finally had answers to the questions I would ask myself about appearances and beauty standards. Why the white girls at my school would praise each other for their spray tans after a vacation, but I was so ashamed of my naturally tan complexion. Why I hated having thick, coarse, wavy black hair, and would wake up an extra hour early every morning to get it to be pinned straight. Why I was so embarrassed that my parents would not allow me to shave my legs because of their customs back home. Why I felt so proud of the beautiful mixed-race Filipina Miss Universe winners, but at the same time felt so invalidated and discouraged as a full Filipino with very Asian features. I even started to think about how my own family made me feel about my looks. My mom would always say to me how she thinks I would be the prettiest out of her Filipino friends if not for my flat, wide nose, which she says I should blame my dad for. I was reprimanded for getting dark in the sun and bombarded with skin-whitening soaps and creams she would buy from the Philippines. I had never realized how much I had internalized the glorification of Caucasian features over those of BIPOCs. This fact especially stood out to me recently after my boyfriend of 4 years cheated on me with a white girl. He was the first white guy I had dated, and I remember at some point when we were dating, I had asked him about his previous crushes. They all happened to be white girls with brown hair and fair skin, just like this new girl. I did not really give this much thought back then, but after this incident, I could not help but think that looking Asian made me a less desirable woman. I really got a wake-up call as to how deeply rooted the self-hate of my Asianness was when one of the first questions I asked him when I found out the news was, "Is she pretty? And is it because you think she's prettier than me?" I couldn't stop thinking, what is it that she had that I didn't? What was wrong with me? Was it my wide, flat nose? Did I look too dark when standing next to him with his extremely pale skin? Were my eyes too small? I felt like I had grown to embrace my Asianness more during high school and college, but this once again took me back to the time where doing so was frowned upon, and I had nothing to tell me otherwise. I thought I had resolved these kinds of issues in high school, but I now understand that slaying the dragon is not a one-and-done type of thing. The Asian American, no hyphen, experience truly is so much more complex than I had realized before taking this course. It does not mean you identify with both groups equally or with one more than the other. And on top of that, it does not mean that one group is better than the other, as many external factors like friends, relationships, or model minority myth may perpetuate. Maybe you don't feel like you will ever truly belong with either group, which I think is most applicable to me. In a way, you belong by not belonging, as I'm sure there are other Asian Americans out there who have had a similar experience. I still don't really have a clear sense of my racial identity, but I no longer feel a pressure to compartmentalize my Asianness from my whiteness. Ultimately, I think I've learned that being an Asian American doesn't mean you have to fall in a category of being too yellow or too white. It's okay to be the ambiguous yellowish beige in between.